Billionaire Daniel Kingsley saw his father crying in the maid's arms. Then she revealed a shocking secret. "Get away from him, you filthy roach." Lauren Chase's voice cracked like a whip through the grand atrium of the Kingsley estate. Outside, thunder rolled across the Chicago skyline. Inside, storm light danced across marble floors, shaking crystal chandeliers. Grace Miller, 32, a live-in maid, stood trembling yet unmoved. Her arm curled protectively around the frail man behind her, shielding billionaire patriarch Charles Kingsley, 78, who clung to her uniform like a child lost in battle. Charles's health had declined sharply in recent months. He now barely spoke, his body thinned by Parkinson's and sorrow. But his eyes, those battle-scarred steel-blue eyes, locked onto Lauren, his daughter-in-law, with haunted recognition. Lauren advanced in her silk gown, eyes ablaze, wine glass in hand. Her high heels clicked like threats across the marble. "He's not your father. He's a burden. And you," she spat, glaring at Grace, "are just a glorified mop with legs. Move." Grace's voice was soft but firm. She said he had asked her to stay. Charles whispered behind her, lips barely moving. "Please, don't leave me. I own this house." Lauren screamed. "I'm Daniel's wife, and once he dies, I'll own everything else." Then she hurled the glass. Red wine and sharp crystal arced toward them. Grace turned, shielding Charles. The glass exploded against her arm. Blood. Gasping. Silence. From the far corridor, unseen, Daniel Kingsley, the billionaire's son, had just walked in. He froze. His father was sobbing. The maid was bleeding. And his wife was smiling. If you're new to this channel, make sure to subscribe right now so you don't miss what happens next. And if you're one of our returning viewers, thank you so much, we appreciate you. Now, stay with us to the end of this story, leave a comment with your thoughts, and like this video if you believe in truth, loyalty, and justice. Let's continue. Daniel's voice cut through the thick silence like a blade as he demanded to know what had happened. He stepped further into the room, his $5,000 Oxford splashing through droplets of wine and blood. Lauren spun around like a snake caught mid-strike. Her tears came instantly, calculated, glistening. She thanked God he was there and insisted that Grace had attacked Charles, claiming his father had snapped like a rabid animal. She ordered him to look at the blood. Grace winced, pressing her sleeve against her arm, trying to stop the crimson streaks from dripping onto the rug. In a trembling whisper, she said it wasn't true, Lauren had thrown the glass, and she had only protected Charles. Lauren shrieked that Grace was lying, that she had always been manipulative, lingering around Charles like some vulture, and accused Daniel of giving the maid too much freedom. Daniel's jaw clenched. He crouched beside his father, gently lifting the old man's hand. Charles's fingers shook as they pointed toward Grace. In a faint voice, he said she had saved him, but his words were so weak Daniel barely heard them. Lauren twisted the moment, saying Charles was confused and didn't know what he was saying. Daniel's gaze moved between his father, his wife, and the bleeding maid. He didn't know what to believe. He muttered that he needed space, backing away, and told Grace to leave the room. Her face broke. She whispered that she hadn't done anything wrong before turning, cradling her arm, and disappearing down the long corridor. Daniel watched her go, but something in his father's eyes kept haunting him. That night, the Kingsley estate felt colder than the thunderstorm outside. The marble halls, once symbols of legacy and power, whispered with servants' gossip. Grace's name passed between them like a curse. Some were skeptical, others were too afraid to speak. "She crossed Mrs. Kingsley," a butler murmured. "She crossed the line," another whispered. Grace sat alone in the servants' quarters, her forearm wrapped in gauze, her spirit unraveling. Her phone buzzed with messages from her sister back in Charlotte, pleading for updates on their mother's cancer treatment. But Grace had nothing left to say. Her job, her income, was hanging by a thread. At the same moment, upstairs in the master suite, Lauren lay nestled beside Daniel. Her tears had dried. Her voice was "honey" again as she murmured that Grace needed to go, that they couldn't have staff making threats in their home. Daniel said nothing, but his mind kept flashing back to Charles's trembling fingers pointing at Grace. The next morning, Daniel summoned Grace to his study. She entered slowly, stiff from sleep and fear. He avoided her eyes as he told her she had crossed the line. He admitted he didn't know what had happened exactly, but there was too much confusion, too much risk. Grace's voice broke as she begged him to believe that she would never hurt Charles. Daniel raised a hand and shut it down. She was dismissed, effective immediately. Her world collapsed. She nodded barely and whispered for him to tell Charles goodbye for her. Then she turned and walked away, shoulders straight but broken inside. As the front door clicked shut behind her, Charles called out from upstairs for Grace, but there was no reply, only the quiet echo of a truth still buried in silence. The sun had barely risen when Daniel found himself unable to sleep. He stood alone in the mansion's security room, bathed in the cold blue glow of surveillance monitors. Footage flickered from hallway cameras, silent and unforgiving. He scrolled back to the previous day. There it was, the wine glass, the throw, the impact. He froze the frame, Lauren's arm mid-swing, Grace's body shielding Charles, blood already blooming through fabric. He rewound and played it again. And again. And again. Daniel's face drained of color. He leaned on the edge of the console, hands trembling. Grace had told the truth. Lauren had lied. His father had been nearly struck by a glass projectile, and Grace had taken the hit for him. And he had banished her, cast her out like trash. His shame burned hotter than any storm. Down the hall, Charles sat by the window wrapped in a shawl, silent. When Daniel entered the room, the old man turned slowly. Daniel told him he had seen the footage, his voice thick with guilt. He admitted that Grace had protected Charles and that he had been wrong. Charles's lips parted and tears welled in his faded eyes. He whispered that he had begged Daniel to see Grace, begged him. Daniel knelt beside him and said he saw her now, but needed to fix this, to make it right. Charles's voice cracked as he told him to go find her before it was too late. Later that evening, Daniel's black Maserati pulled up to a modest diner on the west side of Chicago. And there she was, Grace, sitting alone in a booth by the window, her arms still wrapped, her face turned to the rain. Daniel's shadow fell across her table. She looked up, stunned. She reminded him quietly that she no longer worked for him, calling him Mr. Kingsley. Daniel slid into the booth and asked her to let him speak, not as her employer, but as a man who had failed her. Grace sat frozen across from him, the dull clink of her spoon in the mug the only sound between them. Rain smeared the diner windows like ghostly fingers. Softly, Daniel told her he had seen everything. The cameras had captured it all. He admitted he had been wrong and should have believed her. Grace's lips quivered. She said that wasn't something he could just take back. He agreed, but said he could start making it right. He reached into his coat and slid an envelope across the table. When she asked what it was, he explained it was a new contract, full reinstatement, triple salary, private medical coverage for her mother in Charlotte, and her own suite near Charles's room. Grace blinked hard, her shoulders tightening, and asked why now, was it out of guilt? Daniel answered firmly that it was because his father trusted her, and because he finally understood why. She hesitated, then told him he didn't know everything. He tilted his head and asked her to tell him. Her eyes clouded as she said there were things about his father, about his family, that he didn't know. Daniel leaned forward and asked what she meant. Grace said she couldn't say, not there, not yet. She asked to come back, to care for Charles, but not just as a maid. As someone who'd protected a secret for nearly 3 decades. Daniel studied her, something stirring deep in his chest. He realized this wasn't just about the wine glass. Grace's voice lowered as she confirmed it wasn't, not even close. She slowly stood up, the contract in hand, and said she would come back, but that he wasn't ready to hear the rest yet. As she turned to leave the diner, Daniel whispered, asking if he would ever be ready. Grace paused just long enough to answer without looking back, saying he would be when the truth was ready. The Kingsley estate gleamed in the morning sun, but its pristine marble floors felt colder than ever. Grace stepped through the grand entrance, no longer as a maid, but as Charles Kingsley's official caregiver. Her simple black coat clashed against the opulence. Her expression was calm, but unreadable. The staff paused mid-task. Trays stilled, eyes darted, whispers rippled like a current. "She's back. I thought she was fired. Lauren won't like this." But Lauren was gone. Daniel had made it clear in the staff meeting that his wife had left indefinitely and would not be returning. Still, some eyes narrowed. Others averted. Only one person smiled at Grace, a quiet dishwasher named Natalie, who gave her a small nod of support. Grace nodded back and headed toward the east wing. When she opened the door to Charles's room, he was already sitting upright, dressed and waiting. His eyes lit up when he saw her. He whispered her name. She walked over and took his hand, reminding him gently that she had told him she would come back. He nodded, tears brimming, and said he had never doubted it for a second. Later that afternoon, as Grace passed through the hallway toward the kitchen, conversations halted as she walked by. One maid sneered just loud enough, accusing her of sleeping her way into a promotion. Grace paused, but didn't respond. Another voice followed, warning her that it wasn't over, not with Lauren gone, that someone else would want her place. Grace kept walking. That night, as she helped Charles into bed, he looked at her and told her she would need thicker skin than she ever imagined and that they would come for her. She replied that she had survived worse. He told her she had held worse, too, looking directly into her eyes, and urged her not to carry this burden forever. But Grace said nothing, because the worst burden was still buried inside her, a secret that would either save or destroy the man she was learning to trust. 3 days after Grace's return, the Kingsley household was slowly adjusting. But the silence beneath the marble echoed louder than ever. Daniel kept his distance, watching Grace from afar. She moved like someone carrying more than trays and medications, like someone with history tucked inside her silence. In the city, whispers had begun leaking from Lauren's social circles. Her abrupt disappearance had raised questions. At a charity fundraiser in Chicago's Gold Coast neighborhood, a real estate agent muttered to a gossip columnist that Daniel had caught Lauren in something serious, though no one knew what. By noon the next day, Daniel's attorney slid a manila folder across his desk. Inside were bank statements, property transfers, and a trust fund withdrawal made without authorization. Lauren had forged Charles's signature. Daniel stared at the documents, rage simmering under his calm surface. She had been stealing from his father and laundering it through a private account offshore. Daniel stood abruptly and ordered the estate lawyer called. He wanted the will updated that day and Lauren barred from all future legal access. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Charles's condition worsened. Grace noticed the change immediately, his pulse weakening, his hands clammy. By late evening, he was struggling to breathe. Daniel rushed in to find Grace crouched by the bed, adjusting an oxygen mask. She told him, in a steady voice, that Charles's heart was tired. Charles reached up, his voice barely a rasp, telling Grace that if he didn't make it, she should tell Daniel. She froze and begged him not to make her do it yet, not like this. Daniel stepped closer and demanded to know. Tell him what? Charles's hand dropped as he fell unconscious. Monitors beeped steadily. Grace looked up, eyes damp, and whispered that there was more, much more. But if she told him now, it wouldn't just change his life. She trembled as she said it would destroy everything he believed about himself. Charles remained unconscious into the next day. Monitors hummed in quiet rhythm. Daniel stood beside the bed, arms crossed tightly, while Grace sat at Charles's side, gently wiping his forehead with a damp cloth. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, Daniel broke the silence and asked Grace what his father had meant when he told her to tell him. She hesitated. Her hands trembled. Her eyes searched his. She said Charles had been carrying a truth for 30 years, a truth she had promised never to speak unless he couldn't. Daniel narrowed his eyes, asking truth about what? Grace looked away, her voice almost a whisper, and said, him. He froze and demanded to know what about him. Grace stood and walked slowly to the window, gazing out over the estate grounds. She began to tell him that she had been barely 19 when she started working there. She explained that his father had been distant back then, lonely and tired of lies. Daniel's stomach tightened as he asked what lies. Grace turned to face him fully now, her voice cracking, and said it was the lie about who his mother really was, about what she had done, and about who he was. Daniel snapped at her to stop speaking in riddles, stepping forward. She held up a trembling hand and said she wasn't trying to hurt him, but that when Charles met her and learned to trust her, he had told her something in a moment of weakness, something no man should have to carry alone. Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper as he asked her who he was. She shook her head slowly and said not yet, not while Charles was unconscious. He deserved to be awake to say it himself. Daniel's breath grew shallow as he asked if she was telling him he had lived a lie. Tears slid down Grace's cheeks as she answered that the name on his birth certificate might not be the name of the man who had fathered him. Daniel staggered back like he'd been punched. Silence swallowed the room. The room was dim, shadows stretching long across the polished wood floors. The air hung thick with tension and unspoken questions. Daniel sat in the corner, head in his hands, the weight of Grace's words like an anchor on his chest. Grace stood by the bed, watching Charles's chest rise and fall, steady now but still fragile. Then, a stir, a groan. Charles's eyes fluttered open, his breathing shallow but stable. Grace leaned close and whispered that he was there. Daniel looked up, eyes red-rimmed, jaw clenched, and said he needed answers now. Charles's gaze shifted from Grace to Daniel, no, to the man he had raised as his son. He sighed, his voice like rusted metal, and admitted that people always said they were ready for truth, but no one ever really was. Daniel asked if he was Charles's son. The silence hung for a moment too long. Then Charles nodded slowly, painfully, and said Daniel was his son in every way that mattered, but biologically, no. Daniel stumbled back, his breath leaving him in one violent gust. He demanded to know who his real father was. Charles's voice cracked as he explained that Daniel's mother had lied, that she had an affair with his own brother. He had found out when Daniel was 5, but by then he already loved the boy more than his own life. He swore he would raise him as his own because Daniel was his. Daniel's eyes filled with tears, his hands shaking, as he asked why Charles had never told him. Charles looked toward Grace and confessed that he had been afraid Daniel would hate him and that he hadn't wanted to lose him. Grace stepped in gently, explaining that Charles had only told her when he grew sick. He needed someone to know, someone he trusted. Daniel murmured that all these years he had thought Lauren's betrayal was the worst thing that could happen to him. Charles smiled weakly and told him it hadn't been betrayal, it had been protection. Daniel fell to his knees beside the bed, tears falling freely now. He said he didn't care who had given him blood, Charles had given him everything else. Charles nodded and told him they could start again, with truth this time. The next morning, sunlight broke over the Kingsley estate, casting warm gold across the ivy-lined mansion. But inside the walls, something deeper had changed. Daniel stood at the head of the long dining table, once used for silent dinners and empty toasts. Now it was filled with the estate's full staff. From butlers to dishwashers, from cooks to groundskeepers, all eyes were on him, and beside him stood Grace. Charles sat in a wheelchair near the fireplace, a blanket over his lap, dignity restored in the light of truth. Daniel's voice was steady as he told the staff that many of them had heard whispers and seen injustice. He announced that those whispers ended that day. He turned to Grace and declared that this woman had saved his father's life, that she had been lied about, attacked, and cast out, and that he had believed the wrong person. But no more. Facing the staff again, he announced that Grace Miller was no longer staff, she was family. Gasps rippled across the room. Daniel continued, explaining that he had revised the estate documents. Should anything happen to him, Grace would oversee his father's care, the estate's moral integrity, and the Kingsley Foundation's expansion. He met the eyes of each staff member and warned that if anyone disrespected her or questioned her place there, they would answer to him. The staff fell into stunned silence. Grace blinked, her lips trembling. Later, in Charles's room, she stood by the window as Daniel entered. He handed her a sealed envelope. When she asked what it was, he told her his father had added her name to the foundation's future board. He said she had helped carry Charles's legacy when they didn't deserve her. She opened it and found a check for $2 million. Tears filled her eyes as she said she didn't need it. Daniel smiled and told her she had earned it, not for what she did, but for what she had endured. She walked over to Charles, who reached for her hand. With a tired but genuine smile, he told her she was home now. And for the first time in years, the house felt warm again. Not because of wealth or power, but because truth finally had a place at the table. If this story touched your heart, if you believe truth, loyalty, and quiet sacrifice deserve to be honored, then please like this video and share it with someone who still believes in doing the right thing even when no one is watching. Because sometimes, the people we overlook carry the heaviest truths.